Hello there, welcome to Bungacast, the global politics podcast at the end of history, with George Hoare, Philip Cunliffe, and myself, Alex Hochuli. On today's episode, Phil interviews one of his former colleagues from his time at the University of Kent, Albina Asmanova, about critical theory, the paradox of emancipation, her criticisms of Thomas Piketty, and why we should be thinking in terms of precarity capitalism, not neoliberalism. Albina is a social and political theorist, author of a number of works, including most recently the widely discussed and reviewed Capitalism on Edge, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2020. The interview was recorded on the 22nd of February 2023. Here's Phil and Albina.
So one of the last times that we met face-to-face, or not the most recent time, but the time before that, it was at a book launch last year for another Canterbury colleague and also former podcast guest, Charles Devlin. And when we met at that book launch, you told me that you'd been invited to speak at a meeting of the OECD. And you were especially concerned because the invitation came from a politician who was also, renowned conservative. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how the meeting went, what happened at the meeting, and also perhaps more importantly, if you could also tell us a little bit about the challenges of preserving your scholarly integrity and your intellectual independence as you're being drawn into providing political advice to powerful people and institutions.
Well, in truth, that event was daunting. I was invited to talk about my book on the missing crisis of capitalism and the spread of precarity throughout society at the OECD Council, that is on the level of ambassadors, and the event was chaired by Secretary General of the OECD. It was both brutal and fun. It was brutal because I was in a position of, how shall I say, like a surgeon confronting this hefty patient and saying, you're guilty of not only damaging yourself, your societies, but damaging the world. So what is the OECD? Let's remind our listeners. It is an entity composed of the richest Western countries, aiming, as they define themselves, aiming to stimulate economic progress in world trade. And how did I do this stimulation? By creating a globally integrated capitalism on, the rules of free market capitalism through free trade, and that we all know the outcome of that: environmental devastation and precarity for all. Now, it was brutal in the way that I had to confront the culprit and in a way bring them to account. And I say, well, this is the damage done. And they had to engage with that because that was the whole point of coming to my book talk. But the discussion was very curious because I observed there a split between the neoliberals or the economic liberals, who were still clinging to this vision of progress, material progress through, free market capitalism. And then the more traditional conservatives who are saying, well, yeah, the state has abrogated its responsibility to society, so there's something wrong with that. And it was really good fun for me to observe this clash between the ambassadors. There was at some point when two ambassadors were seriously debating my position. I didn't have to say much. Yeah. So in terms of what is the role of a critical theorist, and don't we risk to become complicit with the people we are advising? Look, I have no patience with dispassionate and politically sheltered critique. I think that so far that critical theory is committed to emancipation. We should also speak truth to power in terms of, you know, advising, critiquing the people who are in power because they have the capacity to do something about the situation. What's important is not to get trapped in partisanship to the left, to the right. This is what I try to stay away from, not to be trapped in an available dogma, even if that dogma makes us very much feel on the right side of history. But this is, as long as we as academics, as thinkers, stay away from dogma and partisanship, we should be engaged in politics.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned, and this is something I did want to talk about, you've mentioned before we talk more directly about the book, you've mentioned a little about your background, and you discuss it a bit in the introduction to the book. You say you're Bulgarian by birth. Well, you are Bulgarian by birth. You grew up in the dying days of the communist regime. And I was wondering if you could tell our listeners a little about this, and how far this experience of towards the end of the Cold War, how far it shaped your political outlook today. And if you could also tell us a little bit more about the dissident politics that you were involved in.
Well, surely so I'm born in 1968, so you can imagine I completely grew up under communism, and I was raised to be a good communist. And I joined the dissident movement as good communists because what we saw around us very much deviated from the plan. The plan was to create a society of solidarity and personal and collective flourishment, and that what we had was actually oppression and mostly political oppression, and a lot of stratification. There was this joke at the time that in the classless society, whiskey is served only in first class. So the elites had this prosperous, privileged life, while the rest of the population lived in economic comfort, but as a second-class citizens. So what made me engaged then, and which brings me back to this idea of, how do we engage in politics while remaining critical theorists? So at the time I engaged as a critical person, criticizing communism from the left. And what's important as a critical theorist is to stay away from partisanship. So because partisanship is dogmatic, and the dogma, socialist, capitalist, any dogma is deadly to critique.
Presumably you came to critical theory at a later point.
No, actually, I studied, I read people like Marcuse and Horkheimer as a first-year student studying political science in Bulgaria, and that was in 1987, 88.
So, and I suppose, was that characteristic of the dissident movement as a whole, the clash between kind of lived reality and what the regime said about itself?
Absolutely. There was, the widely spread language to express our frustration at the time was, this is not normal. So this sense of abnormality, that this is not right. It's exactly the way, the people like Theodor Adorno, the philosopher from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, describes the entry point of critique. When something you experience, you don't know what the right thing is, but we don't need to know what the right thing is as long as we know that something is wrong, and we fight that we're moved by that sense of injustice, and we act on it.
Yeah. And so so you feel, I mean, how formative was the experience of dissidence in the end of the Cold War? How formative has that been for your later kind of intellectual development and career?
My life afterwards was very different. I went to do my PhD in New York. But I guess it was formative because I became dissident twice. First, I fought socialism, or state socialism, and then I wrote a book about how to bring down capitalism. So this apparently I'm attracted to being a contrarian, on the contrarian position, or the dissidency. Yeah, I guess it's a matter of character.
So was there a particular point that you became kind of disillusioned with capitalism at the end of after the end of the Cold War, or was it something that you were always skeptical about with respect to the changes that you wish to see?
Yeah, actually, already under socialism, when we were reading such books, for instance, Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, describing the consumer society. So the consumer capitalism was never something that looked very attractive or very seductive. So there was no point of switch, in fact. We fought socialism, state socialism, without embracing capitalism. So that position has also driven my thinking about alternatives. I don't think we need to be trapped in that binary, capitalism or socialism, and this is very central to my book.
And how do you reckon Bulgaria has fared since the end of the Cold War? And if its experience, say, over the last 20 years or so, if that, or 30 years indeed, if that tells us, if that gives us any kind of insight into capitalist development more generally in the wider world?
Yeah, Bulgaria has fared terribly, as most of the post-communist world. Capitalism has been absolutely brutal there. Especially because it was economic liberalism did not combine with cultural and political liberalism. So it developed as autocratic, heavy, messy, yet heavy, autocratic mafia style capitalism. So no, it has not been a success story. And funny enough, I saw that emerging already while we were engaged in the student protest in 89, 90. There I wrote an article called Dictatorships of Freedom, saying that this pseudo transition to capitalist democracy is in fact something like the old regime coming back from the ashes under a different form, but essentially the same.
And why was it essentially the same?
The same system of privilege, the same system of socialist societies at the time, they were consumer society, truly. I mean, in terms of motivation. So the same kind of vulgar consumerism, it just flourished. Yeah.
And the nomenclatura, I mean, was it the same faces, the same kinds of people?
Actually, the person who at the time threatened to throw me out of the university because when I signed up in this dissident movement, it was an environmental movement. I didn't know that movement was actually doing anything against the party. Yeah, as a good communist, I thought defending the environment, protecting, fighting for human rights.
Yeah,
it is totally in line with the communist doctrine. But then the dean of my university called me and said, "Well, you have signed into a club that doesn't have the blessing of the Communist Party. We have to throw you out of the university, expel you, or you have to withdraw your signature. I didn't withdraw my signature. They did not throw me out, but the same person, once the regime fell, became the leader of the Democratic Party. Yes.
Yeah. I think there, in a
In the
nutshell, is
university.
probably, there, I think, is probably like a story that repeats across Eastern Europe, I'm sure, in many different contexts and circumstances. And just before we get to the book more directly, I'm also curious, and I'm sure our listeners are as well. If you could tell us perhaps a little about how the Ukraine war is filtering into Bulgarian politics, if indeed it is, especially given kind of Bulgaria's traditionally pro-Russian position.
Yes, well, the population is split. There is very much it's the pro-Russian sentiment is there, but there is an understanding generally that this invasion is a terrible thing, and even the Bulgarians are so close to Ukraine, they feel vulnerable, they feel threatened by this invasion. So it's very difficult, exactly this tension between the traditional pro-Russian sentiment, because Bulgaria has been liberated with the help of Russia, both from the Ottoman dominance in the late 19th century, and then from Nazi. Bulgaria was an ally to Nazi Germany. So there is this very deep affinity, sense of brotherhood, and that sense is actually hurt, it's disappointed. But what I find terrible is that people equate, the political regime and Russia. A population is not defined by its political regime, so the Russian population is also a victim of that aggression and of those politics.
Yeah. So I guess if we move then to the matter at hand, which is discussing the book Capitalism on Edge, there's many things I would query or disagree with, but I have to say what I've appreciated the most about the book, and when we've spoken about it before in academic contexts, but it bears repeating in this context as well, is that it's I find it very honest and imaginative and also kind of politically and intellectually forthright in being kind of straightforward in its attempt to break through the kinds of the 20th century legacies, that continue to stymie our thought and our kind of political creativity and imagination. So, I appreciate that. And also the chapter on critical theory, I think, is, as I know I've told you before, but it is, I think, one of the best short accounts of critical theory as a phenomenon that I've read, and it deserves to be, it's an excellent introduction to critical theory and deserves to be on university reading lists in that capacity. So, but beyond the kind of the critical theory, there are some concepts or discussions, ideas which are distinctive, I think, to the argument in the book, and I wanted to talk through them in a bit more detail. Hopefully, you can explain them out for our listeners a bit. So, one of these concepts is this idea of the crisis of capitalism, and you talk about this in some detail. And I wondered if you could explain what you mean by it.
Yes. So there has been all this talk about the crisis of capitalism. The Financial Times at some point ran just shortly after the meltdown, the financial meltdown of 2008, ran a series, Capitalism in Crisis. So there was all this talk. And as I was, listening closely to this talk about crisis of capitalism, I didn't see any crisis of capitalism. So capitalism as a engine of economic growth, of profit creation, was never really in crisis. Even in a broader sense, if we understand capitalism first as a market economy, no, there was no crisis. It was doing very well its job of profit creation. in a broader sense, as a social system, as a society, as we live in a capitalist society, in what sense could there be a crisis? There was no revolution in the offing, nowhere. So it was capitalism as a social system was not really threatened. Socialism, there was some recovery of an interest in socialism, but not that much, among the young. But there was no socialist utopia in
Yeah.
really putting capitalism under threat.
Do you
So there was
mean
no real challenge.
are you talking of things like Occupy? Is that what you mean by the
Yes,
recovery of interest? Yeah.
yes. So there was this general sense of a malaise, something is wrong. Society experiences itself in a kind of chronic inflammation. It
Yeah.
is sick. And yet capitalism itself is not in crisis. So what I describe this situation as a crisis of the crisis in the following sense. So if we're in a crisis, any entity that enters a crisis, it's a deep challenge to the survival of this body. It has three possible exits of the crisis. It's usually short-lived, but we've been talking about the crisis for 20 years. So
Yeah.
these three possible exits: death, returning to the pre-crisis situation, some sort of a healing, or a radical transformation to a new state. Now, but the perpetuation of crisis management, this discourse of crisis and the permanent, crisis management, it became the new normal. It
Yeah.
created a situation in which the crisis itself entered into a crisis. So we're getting us stuck in a perpetual crisis management. Now, and none of these three possible outcomes apply. So in my reading of what's going on, precarity, or this massive, ubiquitous insecurity, becomes this perpetual feature of life, embracing, the 99%, figuratively speaking. So in this sense, I speak of crisis, or a meta-crisis of capitalism, like a crisis entering its own crisis.
So does that mean that there are those three options that you outlined, that they exist to exit from this kind of bizarre interregnum, and that then once we did, it would be back to something kind of approaching or resembling more the development of the last 2 centuries? Would that follow from your idea of a crisis of the crisis?
Well, the options are still there, and we're still stuck, by the way. But so from the left, we have this idea of going back to the post-war welfare state with its relative inclusive prosperity. Now, I don't think this is a good option, because there was a very stiff price to pay to that inclusive prosperity.
Yeah.
First of all, it was a very bureaucratically managed capitalism. That we destroyed the environment, so that's a no-go. But it is a possible exit, yes, and I think there is a very very likely that we're getting there. I don't think it's the right direction to move at all.
So, and do you think this kind of crisis of the crisis, is that also a crisis for the left, in the sense that it is, if it's still kind of stuck in particular modes or habits of thought, or trapped in certain kinds of institutions, then the crisis of the crisis is also a crisis of the left?
Absolutely. Actually, the incapacity or unwillingness of the left to think away from the dogmas, the left dogmas of the past, is generating this situation of being stuck. One such dogma is that worker control, or the socialization of the means of production, worker control of companies, is going to resolve anything. This is, for instance, the solution that Thomas Piketty has launched. This is
And why do you think it wouldn't work?
Well, we have China as an example. Take Huawei. Huawei is owned by the workers, or China is running. The Communist Party of China is running a country as a capitalist economy. So, in the current context of global integrated capitalism, if workers own their companies, of course it will alleviate some of the exploitation, but they will have to compete and therefore to behave as capitalists in the global economy. So not much will change.
So this is your disagreement with Piketty and his followers in terms of greater worker control.
Yes, actually Marx has a very interesting brief disagreement with the socialists at the time about wage equalization and the like. He says all these policies, they would only turn society into an abstract capitalist. Think China. That's so because you make the workers even more complicit, more interested in playing successfully the game of the competitive pursuit of profit.
I find that fascinating, and and something I think we have to kind of come back to on this pod. But another intriguing concept you mentioned in the book, which I wanted to ask you about as well, was what you call the paradox of emancipation. And you speak about this at a number of different points in the book. So can you explain to us what you take to be the paradox of emancipation?
Yeah. So the paradox of emancipation applies, for instance, when women, in the second wave of feminism, were fighting for equality with men professionally. So they want they want to join the rat race, basically, on equal terms with men, forgetting that the problem is not with men, but the problem is with the rat race, with a capitalist economy that exploits, alienates, frustrates, ruins people's lives and nature. So once women achieved equality with men, they deepened this exploitation and the dynamics of capitalism. So that is the paradox of emancipation, that very often when we want equality and inclusion within a model, we actually make that world, that model, more desirable. So we increase its value, although it might be, very negative in its implications for human life.
Have you had? I can imagine. Take your example with feminism, for instance, that it could be seen as controversial in certain quarters, or seen to be perhaps undermining, genuine achievements made by women or by other groups that might be trapped in this paradox, as you outline it. Has it been taken controversially? Have you had lots of criticism or pushback on this point in particular?
Yes, of course, there is pushback, especially as many people have made careers from fighting for women's equality and inclusion in a capitalist economy. But more importantly, there has been also a lot of agreement that we should, fight inequalities and exclusion, but always asking the question, within what system I want to be equal. It's a little bit like that joke of Woody Allen with the club. I don't want to be a member of any club that would have me. It's the reverse.
Yes. Yeah.
Hi there, enjoying Bungacast? Why not drop us a review wherever you get your podcasts? And make sure to follow us at Bungacast across most good social networks, and the bad ones too. Want more Bungacast? Subscribe at patreon.com/Bungacast for $5 a month, and you get at least 2 original paywalled episodes a month, sometimes more, which includes extended interviews, our after parties, Alpha Bonus, where we respond to listeners, and our regular dedicated analyses of current affairs. $10 subscribers get access to our monthly reading club. In the 2023 syllabus that we're currently going through, we discuss in turn freedom, legitimacy, and globalization. Currently, we're going through the brilliant This Life by Martin Hagland, debating secularism, disenchantment, human freedom, and democratic socialism. We'd love for you to join us on our exploration of these themes. So once again, it's patreon.com/Bungacast. Now on with the rest of the show.
So I was very taken with the idea of the paradox of emancipation, and it's something that I would like to think about and develop more myself in my own work. But I also wanted to talk about another aspect of the argument that I was less convinced by, but again intrigued by, was where you differentiate between what you call precarity capitalism and neoliberal capitalism. Mm-hmm. And the reason I was intrigued is because, for most people, I think they would see precariousness, the development of certain kinds of labor practices, the division of the labor market into two tiers between workers that have certain kinds of protections and then kind of more gig economy workers and the so-called precariat and so on. Mm-hmm. They would see this very much as part of contemporary neoliberalism. So can you explain how and why you differentiate between the two?
Okay. Now, I'm going to confess actually why I felt the need to give a new name to the kind of capitalism that we experience. There has been a lot of criticism since the financial crisis to blame neoliberalism for everything.
Yeah.
But as we blame neoliberalism for, all the evils of the world, there is one real culprit that runs away, and this is capitalism itself.
Yeah.
So I wanted to give this new language in order to say, these are all configurations, and I go through 4 stages of the development of capitalism. These are all configurations.
Could you tell us what the 4 stages are?
Yeah, of the same entity, capitalism. So there are some features that stay the same, and neoliberal capitalism has those features of the pursuit of profit, of the destruction of nature. Okay, so to recall the 4 stages or the stages in the life of capitalism, we have the liberal form, the laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century. Then we have the crisis, that model in the early 20th century, the emergence of welfare capitalism that took most of the 20th century. Then we have neoliberal capitalism as some sort of an attempt to recover some of the features of the liberal capitalism based on individual initiative. So entrepreneurial capitalism of the 19th century was based on individual initiative and not much state intervention. So there was an attempt in the late 20th century to recover some of that entrepreneurial spirit of capitalism by reducing the intervention of the state in the economy. And then we have the contemporary form of capitalism, which I call precarity capitalism, in the early 21st century. Now, the reason why I claim that that precarity capitalism has eclipsed neoliberal capitalism is partly because as in the analysis of capitalism, the label neoliberal has been so stretched.
Yeah.
It has come to mean so many incompatible things that it becomes part of the problem. It doesn't clarify anything anymore. So this label emerged already in the 1938, the first use by Alexander Rustow, when he spoke of ordoliberalism as a new form of liberalism, which is marked by state intervention, by the active state management of the economy for the purposes of profit maximization.
Yeah.
So how can we call the withdrawal of the state after, in the 80s and 90s from the management of the economy? and the state intervention in the economy with the same name. I believe that also. So when Foucault used the term in the late 70s, he actually had in mind, he had observed the development of welfare capitalism. So the bureaucratic management of the economy. So I propose in this taxonomy or typology that I've introduced that we speak of neoliberal capitalism in terms of motivation. So, there are two factors marking the difference between neoliberal and contemporary form. In this, so the one factor is how are actors motivated to participate in the system, and the other is what does public authority take on itself as legitimate functions of the state.
Yeah.
So there's this beautiful book by Luc Boltanski and Yves Cepello called The New Spirit of Capitalism, where they describe this motivation as this sexy attraction of the new spirit of entrepreneurial freedom. You make money by doing some program by the swimming pool. So it's the newly gained freedom of not being stuck in one job and with bosses that tell you what to do. So this kind of a sexy capitalism was the spirit of neoliberal capitalism. But this motivation through freedom, through this kind of imagination of control over one's life, has been, I think, almost entirely replaced by motivation through fear of falling out, fear of losing a job, fear of losing it all. As in one survey I quote in the book, a survey of millionaires, over 80% were confessing in this survey of American billionaires that they would rather quit the effort of making more and more money, but they can't do that. They prefer a life of leisure and pleasure, but they cannot do, and the most used term is out of fear of losing it all. So this insecurity, this fear, is the landmark of contemporary capitalism. The other distinctive feature is that while neoliberal capitalism is committed to competition, the contemporary form, precarity capitalism, is committed to competitiveness. And often you achieve that competitiveness by stifling competition. Now, we see it very clearly nowadays in the European Union, for instance, as countries are pushing for more and more the European Commission, which has a very strict competition policy. It doesn't allow state intervention in the economy. Now, member states are pushing very seriously for the European Commission to allow national champions to be created. So with sweetheart deals, merging, so reducing competition for the sake of competitiveness.
So, I have to say, like I said, I'm fantastically intrigued by the idea, and I certainly take your point about the way in which kind of neoliberalism as a term was kind of stretched to almost to the point of total kind of vacuousness. That's said, I keep on, I find it's also one of these terms that's very difficult to do without. But so when would you date the end of neoliberalism to then in your schema? When does it end? When does precarious capitalism begin?
I would date it, and that's just because you're pushing me to date it.
Yes.
At the very turn of the century. So there is a proliferation of commitments in national economic programs to competitiveness. In the European Union, such a document was the so-called Lisbon, we call it the Lisbon program. It is a document, kind of economic policy ambitions adopted at the European Council, that is all the member states, heads of states of EU countries, that declared that they will turn the European economy into the most competitive economy in the world by year 2020. So this language, this commitment to competitiveness came into became a policy priority around year 2000. So this is
Okay.
where I would date.
So so the beginning of precarity capitalism is with this turn of the new century.
The new century, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess this gets to one of the key questions. Then is your view is, given the crisis of the crisis, and given your kind of sensitivity to the systemic question, so not and avoid or being attentive to the paradox of emancipation and the questions of is it systemic transformation or merely inclusion that one wants. So you see capitalism as something to be abolished or transcended or improved or reformed. I mean, what is your view then on that kind of central perennial question for the left?
I think we are standing now at a very unique point in history when there is enough disgruntlement, broad disgruntlement against this precarity, the suffering that precarity causes to workers, to owners of capital, to all the working population, that just fighting the engine of precarity, and that is the rush for profit, the competition for profit, might help us transcend capitalism, move to a different configuration of social, of societal relations, of a new society, a new social order. Now, I am not into designing blueprints for alternatives. My goal is to identify the current moment as this unique opportunity and think about enabling conditions. So the most difficult point in this moment, in this historic juncture, is that precarity is disempowering and even debilitating. So as people live under all these pressures, they have neither the energy nor the headspace to engage politically. So I think that an enabling condition for people to regain some control, to become actors, politically engaged, intelligent, critical, powerful actors, they need a breathing space. So an enabling condition actually paradoxically is to appease capitalism, to reduce the competition, to free more space away from work so that people can start thinking big again. Because under the pressures of precarity, we're all very much focused on the here and now in a crisis management mode that makes us very conservative and even reactionary.
So that goes to my next question, which is to do with you've mentioned the environmental crisis and your concern for it and the way in which kind of earlier systems of capitalism have degraded the environment, degraded nature and so on. So how do you, if you're concerned with resolving the environmental crisis, how do you see that has to be tackled? Without simply perpetuating a new kind of green capitalism, which seems to me to be one likely prospect before us, if indeed it hasn't already arrived. But also, how do you propose to deal with that without simply perpetuating this constant crisis management, as you say yourself, is kind of part of the problem?
Okay, so the ecological crisis and what stands in the way of solving it. I think that humanity has both the scientific capacity and the resources to solve that crisis. What stands in the way is the insecurity under which people, businesses, workers, capitalists, everybody, out of insecurity want to stay in the old polluting economy. So in order to unleash these intellectual and material resources for solving the economic crisis, we first have to free people from their dependence of their livelihoods in the polluting economy. So how do we do that? That's the question, because you cannot simply commit to very hefty ecological goals and say, people would lose their jobs, but it's for the broader good, for the sake of future generations. This simply cannot happen in a democracy, because the Democrats will not support such a project. So we need to create the enabling conditions for people to commit to those environmental goals. And this is what some of my book is dedicated to: how to square social justice and economic justice.
So how does that play out practically, would you say, or what kinds of institutions might help bring that about?
We have some of the institutions. So the institutions of democratic and accountable political order are both, they can serve to deliver that. But I think what is necessary is a push towards certain policies. For instance, if we have to choose between the now fashionable universal basic income or employment insurance to stabilize people's lives, I would not support that. I would rather support what I call universal basic employment, that is job sharing, because we don't want to be trapped in a productivist kind of, workaholic lives. We want to be to decrease our participation in the economy while giving a place for everybody to participate. How did you get there?
Yeah. So, I was talking about concrete proposals for resolving, as you say, questions of economic justice and the environmental question as well.
Right. So one of the groups that is most afflicted by precarity are the self-employed. So there's something being done for workers, but the self-employed in most European countries, for instance, they don't even have unemployment insurance.
Yep.
So some of the policies that we need to implement are very trivial. They are known. So that program doesn't sound very ambitious even. And yet these things are not being done. Therefore, they have to be our ambition.
And on the question of, how do you avoid simply by I suppose the ecological crisis, how do you avoid simply perpetuating the long emergency, or this kind of rule by perpetual crisis management? Isn't that a danger for your position?
I don't follow you. How can that be a danger?
Well, in the beginning you set out this one of the problems being constant crisis management, and you laid this out as part of the crisis of the crisis. So I suppose my thinking, or one of my concerns, is that if configuring society to address the ecological crisis, if that is to be our task, then doesn't that just perpetuate the problem of being in this loop of a constant perpetual crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why, in order to start to enable people to think long term, so either you impose the program on saving nature in an autocratic manner from above. That
Yeah.
might work. I'm not a fan, but that would surely work. Or you believe in green capitalism. I don't think that can work either, because even if we rely on clean technologies, the impetus of capitalism to exploit and to make profit by exploiting resources, and cutting safety standards, and exploiting people would always be there. So green capitalism is not the way to go. What alternative do we have left? It is to create the breathing space for people to think long term, and this is stabilize their livelihoods by not predicating it on
Right.
holding 1, 2, 3 jobs,
Yeah.
but give them the minimal resources. Also, another very important thing in fighting precarity is to enrich the commons. So what? So let me put it this way. Why suddenly inequality became such a disturbing fact? Why comparing ourselves to others, our income, our wealth to others, how come it became such a great point? I think it is because when we live in conditions when now in the commons, for instance, the investment in public healthcare diminishes, and we don't have a reliable healthcare service, reliable access to education. So when the commons are depleted, the money to take care of the essential things of life, then reliance on your personal income becomes more important.
Yeah.
But that's to avoid the paradox of emancipation, redistribution is not going to fix it if we don't invest in the commons.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I find that, I mean, I agree with that. So moving towards the end of our discussion, the book was published in 2020. And obviously, a lot has happened since then, to put it mildly. So I was wondering how you think the book has fared in light of what has happened over the last several years. And if those developments that we've seen, particularly associated with the lockdown and with greater geopolitical competition between East and West, how far does that reinforce or go against the model of precarity capitalism that you outline in the book?
So the book came out in January 2020, and the pandemic hit in February. So
Yeah.
I thought, oh my God, my book is dead.
Yeah.
But actually, there has been a lot of interest exactly because the pandemic brought to light what had remained hidden in plain sight. And that is a massive precarity, because the pandemic confronted us with this strange paradox that even the most affluent, scientifically advanced, politically sophisticated countries could not cope with a virus that was neither too deadly nor completely unknown. So we were simply not prepared because our societies themselves had become precarious by disinvesting from healthcare,
Yeah.
disinvesting in public services, weakening us both as individuals and as societies. So this kind of precarity capitalism has depleted our resources. So I think the pandemic made this clear. And the way the pandemic was handled actually was in a rather neoliberal fashion, because what our governments did is, instead of serious investment in increasing hospital capacity, increasing the medical capacity, they imposed lockdowns and basically burdened, in a very neoliberal fashion, in fact, burdened the individuals with the responsibility to fight the pandemic rather than see what I mean?
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was really
absolutely.
the logic of putting the burden on individuals rather than investing in public services.
Does that undermine the model of precarity capitalism if we had this kind of throwback to neoliberal policy?
So precarity capitalism is an extension of neoliberalism. Every stage of capitalism actually absorbs the features of the previous. It doesn't negate it. So what I'm saying is that it's a neoliberal logic of dumping responsibility on individuals and on groups that cannot carry out that responsibility. And that logic is preserved, is carried over into precarity capitalism.
And then on the question of the increased geopolitical competition, how does that, and particularly with the invasion of Ukraine, how does the arguments in your book kind of fare in light of this?
It's interesting how everybody thinks that Ukraine is a game changer. I don't think it is. Our societies, for instance, you take inflation. I think that inflation was not caused by the war. Of course, the war contributed with the energy crisis, but the way the states dealt with the financial crisis, with the pandemic, actually they accrued all that risk into the public purse. So they had to cope with that by printing more money. Whoever could printed. So inflation has less to do with Ukraine than with the neoliberal way of managing the crisis. So I don't think that Ukraine is such a game changer.
So you think it can be kind of, it sits alongside your model of precarity capitalism. Yeah.
Unless it makes, for instance, the US and Europe collaborate rather than compete. But Joe Biden's policy for green investment, actually it is poaching businesses from Europe. So there is no collaboration there. There's a competition. So the same logic is there.
This has been fantastic, Albena, and I think it will give lots of ideas and insights to our listeners that we'll want to return to in future. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.